Hello and welcome to Failure and Analysis. We're here today to talk about everyone's favorite topic, game balance. I feel like we've been talking a lot about meta slavery, the meta in general, and just, you know, general complaints about my character doesn't do enough DPS. So let's talk about game balance. What are the objectives? What do people want when they say, I want the game to be balanced? Kind of what do they really want? Break down some of those very specific expectations, the specific things people are asking for, what they like, what they don't like, and then the developer's job on how to make that happen or not happen, as the case may be. But trying to meet the expectations of players and also trying to, I guess the big outstanding question is, how do developers talk to their community about balance, right? How do they get them to, how they get them believe that, one, that we're on the same side, we want the same things, and we're working to achieve it, right? Because I think one of the things about one of the misconceptions about game balance is that the devs don't care. They don't want what the players want. That the devs are biased in some way. The classic one is, the devs all play warriors, and therefore warriors are going to be the best in the game because they're biased, right? So don't expect any. Don't expect any fair treatment for any of the other classes, right? But a good developer, one that's worth his salt, is unbiased and works to create foster a sense of balance within the entire game and not just one particular playstyle. The devs want mages to be OP. So true. So true. You'll take what you get and like it. That's right. Tough it out. Get gooder. All right. Okay, so let's talk about balance in general. What is balance? For a lot of people, they consider balance to just be equivalencies, right? If my class does a thing, it gets to here. If another class does a thing, it gets to the same place, right? Perfect balance. 3 different classes, they're all performing at the same level at the end of the day. And this is mostly high end, right? Where balance matters, right? Because balance matters less when the game isn't challenging. So I suppose that's not true. Balance still matters because there's the matter of rate, right? So even if it's easy, you want to be the fastest because you want to collect the rewards that the game offers as fast as possible. So what do players want? They want balance, right? When they're asking for balance, what are they actually asking for? One of the things they're asking for is that, assuming skill is the same on both sides, that the output will be the same. Right? So if you take skill out of it, basically, you'll get to the same place, right? They also want skill to matter, right? And this is kind of an extension of the same idea. Right? So, and this one's really problematic, right? Because they want skill to matter so that if 2 classes are perfectly balanced, or even the same class played by 2 different people, if one is better than the other, they should get better performance, better end result. Right? So that's a common expectation. So what are some irrational thoughts that catch up to this or get caught in this idea of skill matters? One is one irrational thought that players commonly have is that I'm better than I think I am, or I think I'm better than I actually am, right? That's one of the realities. Not really an irrational thought, but one of the problems is players believe that a balanced system will essentially mean that their output is amazing, right? Because people tend to inflate their own skill, right? So if two things are perfectly balanced and I'm awesome, I'm going to get the results I want, right? But typically, people have, an inflated view of their own skill. What else do they want? Here's another question. So within the skill matters thing, if there's a low skill class, right, versus a high skill class, yeah, I can spell. The low skill class should be down here in performance, and the high skill class should be up here, assuming both players are playing to the best of the class's ability, right? So that's another thing commonly asked for, right? Again, skill matters. So if I pick a low skill class and you pick a high skill class, and we're both the same skill level in essence, that you'll outperform me. That's one of the things people frequently want. And conversely, they don't want these to be equal, right? Because if I'm putting in way more work, someone mentioned Windwalker last night. If I'm putting in way more work, way more skill to accomplish my goals, it feels bad that, Johnny Frostbolt over here is getting the same output, right? So they tend to not want that, right? Thank you for the Control Z, by the way. So that's another thing people want. So this sort of establishes the meta, where the character classes sort of fall, establishes the meta. But I'm going to break down some of the concepts of what the meta is and what people think it is, and where I think some of the breakdown occurs. And I'm going to use Tarkov to start as an example. So the meta in Tarkov is, here's the general idea. This is the head, chest, stomach, arms. These are the hit locations, legs, right? Okay, so the meta is just shoot him in the head every time. Shoot him in the head with a bullet that's big enough to kill him in one hit, and regardless of the helmet he's wearing, right? And there are weapons that'll do this. The Mosin will do this, or the SVDS, right? So clearly, the meta is use a Mosin or SVDS and always hit the head, right? Yeah, it's the Michelin Man. That's right. Particularly susceptible. So obviously, the meta is those two guns and shooting him in the head. Here's the problem. Not everyone is Shroud, right? So if the meta is do this is the best way to kill somebody, and then Shroud comes along, right? And he's got really high skill, and he can hit that head, right? So here's maximum performance, here's minimum performance, and Shroud is like right here, right? Because he's super skilled. So this is clearly the meta, right? Here's the problem. Not everyone is Shroud, right? And so you get these guys that are trying to be Shroud, and their performance is complete dog poop, right? And they end up down here because they're not Shroud. NS, not Shroud, right? So there's another meta that emerges. Well, I'm really good at controlling recoil. So, and I know my gun is going to hit, if I aim center mass, I know it's going to hit here first and then kick up and hit here, right? So my goal is, controlling recoil is to aim for the chest, right? Low chest or stomach, right? Now, if I try to do the Shroud approach, I'm going to end up with this performance. But if I try to do my approach, sometimes I'm going to kill him by shooting him in the chest, stomach. and sometimes I'm going to hit him in the head and win that way, right? So my performance is going to be up here if I do the non-meta thing, right? Because my particular skill set, right, working with a different strategy is going to lend it to a higher performance level. For Shroud, he can do the core thing. He can also probably do this better than you, by the way. But he wants his performance as high as possible, so he's sticking to his meta. Now, what kind of gun should this guy use? This guy shouldn't use a Mosin because it takes too long between shots, or even an SVDS. He should probably be using an automatic weapon, whose goal is to do burst fire that kicks up, and use ammunition that can allow and a gun that can allow him to do, multiple shots in a short span of time, right? And so he's got a different loadout. He's got a totally different meta that works with his skill set, right? Other guys can't hit moving targets at all. Shroud probably breathe better than you, true. Other people can't hit moving targets, so maybe their approach is hit the legs. Aim for the legs. There's no armor on the legs in Tarkov, so you use high flesh damage rounds for the legs to blow them off so that he then can't move as quickly, and then you can finish him off, right? The feet tickler strat, right? They call this the leg meta, actually. So that's it's a different gun, it's a different ammunition, and it's a different aim location. And then you might get some people that are really good at that, and so they end up here in the leg meta, right? And that's their particular skill set, right? So meta is a really disingenuous term because Lieutenant Dan meta, I like it. Because ultimately you want to take strategy, add it to skill set, right? Or combine it with skill set. We'll put a multiplier here, right? To get the best overall performance, right? And so trying to force a person with a skill set into a different strategy can have overall negative effects, right? Is essentially what I'm getting at here. So now we'll relate it to WoW. So WoW, we have again the low and the high skill, right? So we'll go ahead and call the low skill guy Captain Frostbolt, right? I'm looking at you, Frost Mages. All he does is spam Frostbolt, and it takes a guy with very little skill, and you get a pretty good performance level, right? I wonder why this is so commonly or so popular, right? No, it's performance, not P. Stop it, Diet Olive. Stop it. Right, so Frostbolt guy can very consistently get this damage, right? And that's desirable. Consistency is very desirable, especially in long fights or, fights that are complicated, or challenging. People that are running them, like the leaders of these fights, they want consistency. They want to eliminate as many chaotic factors, as many RNG or random factors as possible so that they can focus on the things that they can control or can't control and try to manage those. Okay, so then there's Shadowbolt Warlock. We had this discussion as well. Destrolock, right? Now he's got a higher skill requirement back in Classic, right? And the reason was because he had very little threat mechanics, and his crits were pretty wild, right? So there's more skill in that you have to know when to back down, right? If you're a Warlock and you're firing Shadow Bolts and you're playing like the Frost Mage, there's a higher chance that you're going to die because you're going to pull aggro and die, right? So it required a little bit more skill to manage because of that wild nature, and that was intentional because of the theme of the Warlock, right? More chaos, more variance, more less, more opportunities for bad things, right? Cool Warlocks never back down. That's right. So here we have the Shadowlocks doing this. We have the Frost Mages doing this, right? And this, by the way, shout out to my buddy Threat System. This is actually another indication of why the Threat System does such good work, right? Because it creates a skill variant for the Shadowlock, the Destrolock, to have to worry about, right? Because without a threat being a concern, Frost is just strictly worse, right? But in this scenario where threat matters, and it's difficult to maintain, both of these things matter, right? And they apply to different skill sets, right? So threat going away or out of the game or becoming too easy to manage is really bad in creating parity between different types of character templates. Because when everyone can just go hog wild, then it really is just who gets the most value out of pushing buttons, right? So I think threat, again, just does good work here. Okay, so we have this case where high skill, which is, again, something the players want, is, when done well, is outperforming low skill. But it has that problem of, if this guy doesn't have enough self-control, he should be playing a Frost Mage or maybe a Hunter or something like that. Something with more, threat management buttons, right? So that he can go hog wild, and then if he gets in trouble, he just feigns and goes back to being Captain Hog, right? How you doing, War Crimes? So yeah, and this is what players want. But what happens? What happens in the long term? So, because there's always that Destrolock that is good, right? There's always one in the guild, and he's outperforming, right, the Frost Mages, who are not as good. Let's just assume that they found the perfect match for their skill set, right? Because some of them might go over here and try to do this, and they might be good enough to be this, right? And then they might feel like Frost is lame, right? Some of them will go and they won't be able to do it because it's got a higher skill requirement. They'll realize the grass isn't greener, and they'll go back to Frost, right? But regardless, over time, complaints start coming out of this camp, right? This camp is like, well, I'm tired of the fact that Destrolocks are so much better in the raids, right? They're getting higher performance. Where's the game balance, right? But the Frost guy, again, believes that he's better than he actually is. So he's going to deliver higher DPS overall as Frost than he is, in some cases, as a Destrolock. Because when he goes over here, he's going to die too much. So he's going to be dirt napping, and he's actually going to perform like this, right? And sometimes the Destrolock is also dirt napping, but he makes up for it across, let's say 100 raids, and this is like overall performance level, right? But anyway, this guy is unsatisfied with his pecking order, and he believes, well, I could do that too, so why not just allow me to do that, right? Because I think I'm better than I actually am, and I really want to play a Frost Mage, so I don't want to play the stupid lock, right? So, hey, game devs, change it so my values are up here, right? So, and let's say the good designers listen. They listen to players, as is demanded so frequently, right? And they put Frost Mages up here with no other changes, right? So now they're equivalent, and the Destrolock is like, well, that doesn't feel good. I have to do all this extra work, right, to get this performance. It's actually difficult. And now this guy who's just spamming Frost Bolts is getting what he wants, right? So there's two versions of the game. There's this version, and then there's the other version where Frost and Shadow are equivalent, right? Which game is better balanced, right? This is the tough question. is A better balanced or is B better balanced, right? Welcome to the life of a feral cat. Yeah. And it's hard to know. It's really hard to know what skills are required and how good you would be in another class's shoes without, especially back in Classic, when it was harder to make a max level raid ready character, where a lot of this discussion was going on, or a lot of the meta was being established, right? So we've got some of this going on, and that different people should be doing different things based on their skill sets, right? And then we also have the question of, well, which game from a philosophical standpoint is the better balanced game, right? Because people ask for this, right? But that disregards the things that we've talked about that actually matter to players. They want skill to matter. And that essentially creates inequity, right? Not everyone wants this, right? Some people want this. But my contention is that this is the better design, right? And over time, this has gotten more difficult because of things like the removal of threat and how hard it is to maintain. And I don't know if there is a level where threat matters a lot, but it from what I've heard from a lot of people, that threat has kind of gone bye-bye. It's much easier to maintain threat. Then you also have the difference like AoE versus single target, where threat can matter a lot, because threat is a cap on, like, it's harder to generate AoE threat than it is single target threat in a lot of cases. And so different classes have different strengths, right? So you can play into that as part of the game design. And so your content can be a lot more interesting. Your monsters can be a lot more interesting if you have different types of skill sets or different types of characters doing different types of things. It creates a much larger design space, right? When everyone is essentially somewhere in the middle, right? Like, everyone has the same skill requirements. Everyone has the same abilities. They all have the same threat management tools. They all have the same heal tools. Like, they all have the same burst tools, right? It gets harder to make mechanics or content that challenges different sets in different ways. And you have to come up with kind of generic ones that affect all players equally, which I think is a lot less diverse and a lot less interesting, right? So they're also doing themselves a disservice when designers head towards this utopia, right? Which some players are asking for. It gets harder to make the game fun, because when you have variance in the types of players there are, the types of classes, you can do a lot more interesting things. A pretty good example is Nefarian. Who thinks Nefarian is a fun fight? And I would say the reason it's an entertaining fight is because it challenges each of the classes by putting them in an uncomfortable place, right? But it's only temporary, and then there are moments where you get to shine, right? So, but each one is a mixture of strengths and weaknesses, right? Like mana is another great one that's kind of gone away in later stages of WoW. But mana also creates this issue of, Frost Guy might be able to go for a long time, and then he has to use mechanics like Evocation, which drop his DPS down for a little bit, and then he's back to the races, right? Boomkins might be out of mana in this short time, but hopefully they do a lot of burst, right? So they're really good in short fights, not so good in other fights. And obviously there were class problems with the Boomkin for sure, but the idea is that they play differently, right? and have moments where, and then it's up to the content to sort of leverage those differences in cool ways so that each class has its moment to shine, right? Just stop. You haven't suffered enough. Yeah. I apologize, Boomkins. I apologize. So, but yeah, so in my impression, this is the better, balance goal, right? Because it accomplishes the things that players want. But how do the developers communicate is the big question. Without, again, pulling out the whiteboard and walking everybody through it. How do they properly communicate that this is the goal, not this, and that if you're a Frost guy, that's okay. You're better at Frost than you would be at Destrolock. And Frost will, always sort of be needed because people will like consistency, right? But then this guy also has an opportunity to shine as well. So they both have opportunities, right? Boomkin is balanced round fights lasted 55 seconds or less. All right. Eyes and a belly button. Well, yeah, sort of. Those 2 eye shots, head, eyes, and it's more of a sternum shot. This is the stomach, but yeah, I like it. Yeah. Am I not playing Classic anymore these days? The center nipple. There you go. I haven't played Classic in a while, but I will go back at some point. Should we have low skill classes, though? It essentially makes a player choose their output cap before they know anything about the game. Yeah, that's a great question. And yes, you should have lower skill classes. The reason for that is... and again, that lower skill is like... well, skill sets. There's lots of different kinds of skills. And there's lots of different ways for people to, in an MMO especially, to show their strengths, right? You can bring a lot of different skill sets to the game, right? For example, a great one is the guild leader. He's trying to manage a million things during the raid. So maybe a class that is pretty simple on the button, Frost Spam, is just right because he's trying to coordinate big picture stuff, right? And so his skill that he brings to the game that leverages what he's good at to create success for a large community of people is different than, the Shroud who's hitting the head every time with his Hunter, right? Hunter aim shot. Bad example, I know, but it's a stretch. But the Shroud who's playing the high skill class and knocking it out of the park, right? Different skill sets that are both sort of needed in order to be successful. And so that's one part of it. The other part is, at the end of the day, it's a role-playing game, and you want people that aren't good at games necessarily to be able to live out their fantasies and their dreams, and have some get some joy by being an accomplished player in some respect. And again, there's lots of skills that can make that happen, but not every class should be successful via the same axis, right? Is basically what I'm saying. You should try to create, in my opinion, again, always, try to create a wide variety of skill sets, and then people get attracted to different things and realize they're good with some and others than others, and what's important for their needs compared to everything else they're trying to do within the game. And so, it's a great question because a lot of high skill players, or just a lot of players that have really big strengths in certain areas, frequently want that be the thing that's tested in a game, right? Because then they get to be really high on the achievement charts, right? So making an FPS, right, for Shroud to play, where every hitbox is the same, would not satisfy Shroud, right? He'd be like, what the hell is this? Like, it doesn't even matter where I shoot a guy. Like, that's completely ignoring my skill set. That sounds like a terrible FPS game, right? And he's kind of right. But for MMORPGs, we want to test a lot of different variety of skills. Quake says hello, yeah. We want to test a variety of skills, and we want more players than, players that are very skilled like Shroud to be able to play and enjoy the game in a variety of different ways. So it's also a slightly different objective for a game like WoW. But great question. What else did I want to say about balance? What else did I want to say? Oh my gosh, am I getting my first 30-minute video? Yeah, and a lot can be handled through specs, right? And itemization, procs, the procs that you pick up, sockets, How do professions factor into skill and balance? Yeah, so professions require different skill sets, right? One is you're more of an explorer type. You learn how to get the resources you need. There's usually more socialization in there if you have to interact with other crafters or your customers, so to speak. Those require different skills. You have to understand economy, pricing, things like that. So, I suppose what you're asking is where do we put, sulfurous essentially, or not even sulfurous, just what was the sword that was really powerful for a while? Arcanite Reaper, obviously, but there was one before Arcanite Reaper that was super desirable. No, it was just a regular craftable. Wasn't even max level, I don't think. Back in the day when everyone wasn't 60 in 3 days, there was a sword that people were using, and I can't remember what it was, but it was very desirable. True Silver, yes, thank you. Yeah, the True Silver. Yeah, so where was I going with that? Oh yeah, where do you put that, or in terms of power level, when it's just something that you can craft with sort of mundane stuff, right? But you have to sort of figure that out, where are the power levels of all these things. But in my estimation, in my perfect sort of design world, professions matter, all along. And that could be, but the mats is what creates the possibility that, keeps professions relevant, because where you get the mats can be as hard as, off of Ragnaros or the nearest boar, right? So you have full flexibility. You also have flexibility to say, like in BRD, it has to be crafted in a certain place. So you have to get a team to go down there and craft it. So there's lots of ways to make professions relevant and super fun. Even though his strengths are, again, becoming the best at that profession, which require different skill sets than being a total baller on the, parses, right? So what should you do? This cuts back to meta slavery, right? Like when Shroud and his followers, right, tell all these other guys, what's wrong with you? You should be running an SVDS or a Mosin and just shooting people in the head, right? It's appropriate for the rest of this group to say, screw off. No, I can't do what Shroud does. This is me when I try to be Shroud, right? I should be doing the leg meta, or doing the my own. I should be leveraging my own skill set, right? But this is tough. It's tough to say that because people don't understand. They just want you to be like Shroud, and they judge you based on how close to Shroud you are, right? So I understand the problems, but there are legitimate responses to people that are trying to tell you how to meta. When you're like, well, no, this is just better for me. Do you think profession should keep up and always be able to provide raid equivalent gear power? Well, I always go back, Flavis, to what does it require to get the items, right? At the end of the day, it's we're putting weapons in hands, right? So what does it require to put the weapon in the hand? And this is something that one of the contracts that retail has broken over the years. And the contract is, if you do solo play, you can make greens. Or you can get greens. If you do group play, you can get blues. And if you do the hardest group stuff in the game, you can do purples, right? So there are occasionally breaks to that. In other words, like rep grinds that give blues, or PvP grinds that give blues or purples, right? But those are pretty extreme cases. But most of the time, the contract is, if it requires solo participation, it's a green, right? But the AH to buy mats is also in line with that, because theoretically, if the economy is healthy, stuff you're going to sell is at prices that groups can afford, right? So groups make a lot more money in, like theoretically you make more money doing dungeons, and more money still by doing raids than you do by doing solo content. That it isn't always true, because you're at a different difficulty. Depends on the challenge. Like if you're just farming versus you're trying to beat for the first time, repair costs and all that can make raiding very expensive. But at the end of the day, the rewards for grouping and killing harder stuff in groups, in other words in dungeons, should yield better rewards, both item-wise and monetary-wise. And so you then can put the prices up, or you can sell things for appropriate prices for that. And then the guy who's trying to buy mats on the auction house has to farm his butt off solo in order to afford those things, if that makes sense. So if you play long enough, yeah, everybody gets a legendary. That's right, Diet Olive. So yeah. Are we then not assuming people cannot, through practice, improve themselves so they graduate from the leg meta to the recoil meta to the shroud meta? Absolutely. As you get better, your skill set can improve or potentially change. But that isn't always the case. So the big question is, like, what is it that your skill set brings, and what's the best strategy to leverage that skill set, right? Then you create your own personal meta. And that can absolutely change over time. You can get worse. Like, I have gotten worse at FPSs, so I'm the guy who is even further away from Shroud the older I've gotten, and has to employ these other strategies, like bush camping, in order to kill people, right? So more of this and less of the, right? So yeah, those skill sets can change, and you should change with it. What undermines much of the ability to say, "Nah, I'll do it the way I want," is that you actually can't. Yes. Right. It's difficult for you to say, "No, I'm doing it my way, take it or leave it," because they leave it. And that's part of that, obviously, is because Dungeon Finders has made the accessibility of groups and other people too easy. Right? So, and a lot of this is dependent on a system where you can't just easily switch, right, between specs, between classes, and try everything, right? And so the be able to try everything works against the game design when it comes to trying to foster this idea that people find their own meta, right? Because a lot of times it's like, well, I can't switch realistically, so I gotta make do with the tools at my disposal, right? But you're absolutely right, Philzor. It's gotten really bad out there, right? Obviously, the meta stuff is at an all-time terrible. So it's tricky, but yeah, keep in mind when you're trying to perform, right? And it also just comes back to put a lot of your effort, put less of your effort into trying to get your item score up and more of your effort into trying to find a play group that actually meshes with yours, because you'll have a much better time. So I'm going to close the video there. It's a good discussion. We can answer some more questions offline, but thank you very much for watching, everyone. I hope you enjoyed it. Please gently click the like button if you enjoyed it. And if you want to see more stuff, subscribe away. And hope to read your comments down below. And yeah, come follow me on Twitch. Say hi. I'll see you next time.